The galaxy stood still the day silence became a weapon. Imagine 1,000 ships hanging in the void, guns loaded, crews ready to fire, and suddenly not a single one of them can utter a word. Not an order, not a cry, not a prayer, just silence, thick as tar, covering the entire fleet in a single second. And in the center of this silence stands a man, an ordinary man, in ancient armor, older than the memory of the galaxy itself. And when he finally spoke, the universe spoke with him. But to understand how an ordinary miner from a fringe colony found himself at the center of events that silenced 3 races that had ruled the stars for thousands of years, we must go back in time to where it all began with a single discovery in a dead mine on a forgotten planet, one that even the galaxy's own maps had erased from the registry as worthless. The planet was called Karai 9, gray, windswept, its crust cracked as if someone had struck it with a hammer of incredible force long ago. People didn't come here for beauty. They came for ore, a rare mineral that burned blue in reactors and was worth more than entire star systems elsewhere in space. By then, humanity had long ceased to be the master of its own destiny. 3 great races, the Dorn, cold and logical, the Valar, arrogant and ancient, and the Zet, ruthless conquerors, had divided the stars among themselves even before humans learned to fly beyond their atmospheres. When humanity finally entered space, there was no place left for it. Only those holes, those outskirts, those exhausted minds, and dead worlds that no one needed. Karai 9 was just such a hole. And there, into the darkness of forgotten shaft number 7, descended a man named Dalton Reyes. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a tired 42-year-old man, with callous hands and eyes where the light of hope had long since faded. He went down into the mine every day, because his daughter was waiting for him up there, needing medicine that cost more than he earned in a month. He wasn't thinking about the fate of the galaxy. He was wondering if this shift would be enough to buy her another week of life. And then on that ordinary day, as his machines drill bit into yet another layer of rock at a depth of 3 kilometers, something went wrong. The machine groaned like a living thing, metal screeched, and the entire tunnel shuddered, as if the planet itself were shuddering in pain. Dalton froze. His partner, a young man named Kim, shouted for him to stop, but it was too late. The drill hadn't just penetrated rock. It had punched through the wall of an ancient chamber, hidden so deep that not a single scanner or satellite, in all the years of exploration of this planet, had even suspected its existence. The dust settled slowly, as if reluctantly, and when the light from the lanterns pierced a cloud of stone chips, Dalton saw something that made his heart stop in his chest. The room wasn't natural. It was constructed. The walls, smooth as glass, were covered in symbols that glowed with a soft golden light, as if the darkness itself were afraid to extinguish them. And in the center, on a pedestal of black metal, stood a suit of armor. It was unlike anything humanity had ever created or seen from any other race. It was simultaneously ancient and alive. The metal, if metal it was, shimmered like liquid silver mingled with starlight. It was unrusted, uncovered by the dust of centuries. It was as if time had simply refused to touch it. And as Dalton approached, feeling the air around him thicken, the armor trembled, barely, as if something within it, something dormant from millennia, opened its eyes. Kim screamed at him to stay back. His instinct for self-preservation screamed the same. But Dalton, a miner, a father, a man with nothing left but despair and love for his daughter, did what people throughout history have done when faced with the unknown, which could kill or save them. He extended his hand, and the moment his fingers touched the metal, the galaxy, though no one knew it yet, began its countdown. The light flared so brightly that Kim covered his face with his hands, screaming from the pain in his eyes. The tunnel filled with hum, a low, vibrating sound, as if an ancient beast had awakened, sleeping for millions of years. And when the light faded, Dalton stood where he had been. But he was no longer just a miner. The armor clung to his body like a second skin, merging with him without a single seam, without a single connection point. It simply became him. He felt power coursing through his veins, his mind filled with whispers in a language he'd never heard but somehow understood. Voices, thousands of voices, the voices of those who had worn this armor before him. He didn't know then that this armor belonged to a race that vanished 10,000 years before the first man looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond. A race that the ancient Valor chronicles whispered, afraid to speak aloud, the Eshkur, the goddess of war and silence, as they were called in the midst of three great civilizations. A race that built a weapon so powerful that the gods of their own legend feared it and locked the last armor in the most forgotten corner of the galaxy, where they thought it would never be found. They were wrong. They did not foresee man. Dalton didn't remember how he escaped the mine. He remembered only Kim's eyes, filled with horror and awe, when he saw him walking through the rubble without a scratch, his armor seemingly breathing with him. He remembered falling to his knees on the planet's surface, looking up at the stars, and cried for the first time in years, not from pain, but from the feeling that for the first time in his life he was no longer powerless. But the galaxy has its own laws, and one of them is that nothing powerful goes unnoticed for long. The Dorn detected an energy surge from Karai, 9 for 6 hours. Their sensors, the most sensitive in the known universe, registered a pulse that didn't match any known technology. The Dorn Council, cold and calculating as always, immediately dispatched a scout ship, but the Whalars, the Zet whose ancient archives preserve references to the Ushkurs as a forbidden horror of the past, recognized the surge instantly, because their priests had been waiting for this very signal for centuries, praying it would never come. But the Zet, whose empire was built on fear and conquest, simply sensed a force, like sharks smell blood in the water, and rushed to Karai, 9 with a fleet ready to take everything they found there at any cost. 3 great civilizations, barely tolerating each other for centuries, suddenly found themselves focused on the same forgotten speck of dust in space. And at the center of that speck stood a man who, just yesterday, simply wanted to return home to his sick daughter. The Zet arrived first. Their ships, black as night and just as merciless, emerged and jumped directly over Karai 9, casting a shadow over the colony's skies that left every inhabitant frozen in terror. Their commander, a being named Gortak, renowned throughout his empire for brutality with which he suppressed rebellions, immediately issued an ultimatum: surrender fine, or the planet would disappear from the map. The colony, of course, had neither weapons nor defenses to withstand the conquering fleet. The people prepared for the worst, for what had happened to many human colonies before, when a stronger race decided they needed something. They hid their children in basements. They prayed to gods they had long since ceased to believe in. They said goodbye to each other in whispers, fearing these would be the last words they would ever speak. But Dalton Reyes stepped into the open space in front of mine, just as the Zet drop pods began to descend to the atmosphere, leaving trails of fire in their wake. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't know tactics. He didn't know how to command. He knew nothing of war. But the armor did. The armor remembered 10,000 years of wars waged by a race long since vanishing the galaxy, leaving behind only legends and fear. And when the first Zet pod touched down and warriors emerged, clad in chitinous armor and armed with weapons capable of piercing tanks, Dalton felt the armor tense against his body. An ancient voice in his mind whispered a single word in a language that hadn't existed for millennia: protect. What happened next? Videos and recordings from orbital stations spread throughout the galaxy within 24 hours, and not a single race that saw this footage could fully believe their eyes. Dalton didn't run. He didn't hide. He stepped forward, facing a dozen Zet warriors, each trained to kill from childhood, each one battling through dozens of wars on dozens of worlds. And as they opened fire, expecting to see the man fall dead as all men had before him, the armor around Dalton flared with the same golden light as in the underground chamber, and the shots simply vanished into thin air, missing their mark. The Zet warriors froze for a moment, that moment that in battle often means the difference between life and death. And Dalton, driven by an instinct that wasn't his own, but that now lived in every cell of his body, made a single movement with his hand. A wave of energy, invisible yet tangible, like a hammer blow, coursed through the ground and threw all 12 warriors back dozens of meters, leaving them motionless but alive, because even as the power coursed through him, something deep within Dalton, something human, refused to kill unnecessarily. Gortak, watching from orbit, felt for first time in his long and brutal career something he had never felt before: doubt. He ordered the next wave of landing forces to retreat and began orbital bombardment, deciding that since the Earth's forces were immune to close-quarters weapons, orbital strikes would solve the problem more quickly. Plasma bolts rained down on Dalton's position like a fiery rain, capable of vaporizing an entire city. The colony's inhabitants, watching from afar, screamed, certain they were witnessing the final moments of the man who had tried to protect them. But when the smoke cleared, Dalton stood there, unharmed, and the ground around him was scorched into a perfect circle, as if the armor itself had deflected the fire, protecting not only him but everything behind him, the colony, the mines, the people hiding in the basements. At that moment, a second fleet, the Dorn, appeared in orbit around Karai 9, coldly calculating, arriving to investigate the anomaly rather than fight. Their ships, elegant and technologically advanced, formed into battle formation at the sight of the Zet fleet, and tension in the system soared to breaking point, ready to explode into a full-scale war between the two great powers right over the heads of bewildered humanity. And then the Whalars came. Their fleet didn't appear as other races' fleets did, with the roar of engines and the flash of jump points. It appeared in silence, almost ghostly, as if reality itself had parted to admit their ships, ancient and covered in symbols that glowed with the same golden light as Dalton's armor. And in that moment, the three greatest powers in the galaxy found themselves nose to nose over a forgotten world, the existence of which none of them had even considered a week ago. The Whaler High Priestess, a being named Solara Ein, whose lifespan had been extended for 5 centuries by her race's technology, contacted both the Zet and Dorn fleets simultaneously, her voice calm but filled with suppressed terror ringing out across all known frequencies. "You have no idea what you woke up." She spoke, briefly, because time was pressing and the fears she carried for centuries had finally found a way into words, of a race called the Eshkur, a civilization that, 10,000 years ago, had achieved a level of military might sufficient to destroy any known race in the galaxy single-handedly, of how their own gods, according to the most ancient Whaler records, feared this power so much that they locked the last functioning Ishkur armor, the armor of the goddess of silence, as it was called, for the ability to silence entire fleets, in the farthest, most forgotten corner of known space, hoping it would never be found. She was found by a man. This revelation changed everything. Gortak, the Zet fleet commander, whose ruthlessness was built on self-assurance, suddenly realized he was facing something that could wipe his empire from the galactic map. Began recalculating the risks of his military clash with a being whose power was literally unknowable to their science. And Solara Ein, standing on the bridge of her flagship, looked at the recording of a man standing on scorched earth, and she saw not a conqueror, not a monster, not a weapon. She saw a father simply trying to defend his home. The negotiations that followed were the most tense in the history of the known galaxy. Each race demanded their own. The Zed insisted that the discovery belonged to the strongest, and by their logic, the strongest was whose fleet still outnumbered the combined forces of humanity by 1,000 times. The Dorn insisted on studying, controlling, and safely containing a technology whose power terrified even their coldest calculations. And the Whaler, driven by an ancient horror, demanded the immediate destruction of the armor before it reawakened the powers their ancestors had locked away for a reason. But none of them asked Dalton Reyes himself what he wanted. And when he finally spoke, for the first time since the chaos began, standing before the combined fleet of 3 civilizations, each ready to destroy the other for his possession or destruction, his voice, amplified by armor technology, sounded not like a threat. It sounded like a man tired of being afraid. "I did not come to conquer you," he said, and the words echoed across all the communication channels of the 3 fleets simultaneously, because the armor living on him had decided it was time to be heard. "I came here to feed my family. You 3 races have divided the stars between yourselves for thousands of years, and to us humans, you have left only dust and debris. We never asked for war. We asked for space. A tiny place to live." The silence that followed those words was the same silence that silenced the galaxy, not because the armor's power had silent sensors and communications, but because for the first time in tens of thousands of years of history, these ancient, powerful races heard what they had never allowed themselves to hear, the voice of those they considered too weak to have a voice. Gortak, whose empire was built on the belief that might makes right, was the first to break the silence, and his words surprised even his own officers. "If I had 10 warriors like you, I could conquer the galaxy within a decade," he said, and despite all the brutality, there was something akin to respect in his voice. But you're not a warrior. You're a protector. That's more interesting. The Dorn, ever practical, offered a deal. They would study the technology together, provided that humanity would be given an official seat on the Galactic Council, a seat they had never had, despite having flown among the stars for nearly 2 centuries. And Solara Ein, the high priestess of a race that had feared this day for centuries, looked at Dalton longingly and spoke words that would later become part of a legend told throughout the galaxy. The Ishkur built this armor to protect the helpless from the tyranny of the strong. For 10,000 years, we feared it would fall into the wrong hands. But perhaps we were wrong about whose hands were right. What happened next changed the fabric of the entire known universe. Humanity, which had huddled on the fringes of the galaxy for centuries, gained not just a seat at the table of 3 great civilizations. It gained respect, rested not by force of arms, but by the strength of character of one man who refused to use his given power for conquest, even though he could have. Dalton Reyes became a legend, known by the name the Whalars bestowed upon him in awe and admiration. The Silent Guardian, the one whose silence fleets not with rage, but with justice. But behind this tale of fleet wars and ancient civilizations' negotiations lay a far simpler, far more human story. The story of a father who descended into a mine to earn money for medicine for his daughter, and who, having gained the power to wipe the stars from the sky, used it not to become a god among mortals, but to finally sit by his daughter's bedside, take her hand and say, "Everything will be all right. Now we have a home." The goddess's armor, which had lain dormant for 10,000 years, awaiting one worthy of its power, finally found its master. Not in a warrior, not in a king, not in a conqueror. It found him in a simple man who remembered what it meant to be weak, and for that very reason, knew how to be strong. And as the fleets of the 3 great civilizations slowly drifted away from Karai 9, each carrying in their archives a record of the day when the galaxy fell silent before a man in ancient armor, somewhere in a small house on an outlying colony, a girl named Mila, still weak from her illness but with eyes full of hope, looked at the stars in the night sky and asked her father if it was true that he was now a hero. Dalton, taking off his armor for the first time in days and feeling like a man again, tired but alive, smiled at her and said what became the final and most important part of this legend. "I'm not a hero, sweetheart. I'm just a father who was finally able to protect you." And somewhere out there, among the stars, the ancient armor, now lying in his home and not in a forgotten mine, glowed quietly with a golden light, as if agreeing with him. For the power that gods and civilizations feared always sought not a conqueror, but one who could love enough to protect without destroying. Thus ended the story of the man whose armor had silenced the galaxy, not with the thunder of guns, but with the quiet respect that 3 great races had finally learned to feel for those they had for centuries considered too small to matter. Silence fleets not with rage, but with justice. But behind this tale of fleet wars and ancient civilizations' negotiations lay a far simpler, far more human story. The story of a father who descended into a mine to earn money for medicine for his daughter, and who, having gained the power to wipe the stars from the sky, used it not to become a god among mortals, but to finally sit by his daughter's bedside, take her hand and say, "Everything will be all right. Now we have a home." The goddess's armor, which had lain dormant for 10,000 years, awaiting one worthy of its power, finally found its master. Not in a warrior, not in a king, not in a conqueror. It found him in a simple man who remembered what it meant to be weak, and for that very reason, knew how to be strong. And as the fleets of the 3 great civilizations slowly drifted away from Karai 9, each carrying in their archives a record of the day when the galaxy fell silent before a man in ancient armor, somewhere in a small house on an outlying colony, a girl named Mila, still weak from her illness but with eyes full of hope, looked at the stars in the night sky and asked her father if it was true that he was now a hero. Dalton, taking off his armor for the first time in days and feeling like a man again, tired but alive, smiled at her and said what became the final and most important part of this legend. "I'm not a hero, sweetheart. I'm just a father who was finally able to protect you." And somewhere out there, among the stars, the ancient armor, now lying in his home and not in a forgotten mine, glowed quietly with a golden light, as if agreeing with him. For the power that gods and civilizations feared always sought not a conqueror, but one who could love enough to protect without destroying. Thus ended the story of the man whose armor had silenced the galaxy, not with the thunder of guns, but with the quiet respect that three great races had finally learned to feel for those they had for centuries.